Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of What's the Tea? My name is Zach, and I'm a community educator here at Anew, Building Beyond Violence and Abuse. And I've got two awesome guests here with me who I would love to introduce before we even get started. So first, we've got Kerry. She's our community education program manager,
Thanks for having me.
of course. And we've got former employee slash current teacher, Mitch Condon. Mitch,
Yeah.
welcome.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Well, thank you both for being here. So, the main topic, as you can probably see in the title, is the intersection of domestic violence in sports. And we've had a really good conversation, kind of boiling even before we've hit the record button. So, I'm really excited to get this started. So, I think we can start maybe with why are we covering this topic? And I can start, and then maybe if either of you would like to jump in, that would be awesome. So I think one of the main reasons is that athletes are role models to kids. They are, when there is a domestic violence case, it's huge news. Um, and a lot of media coverage, and those become talking points for domestic violence. And that may be some of the first times that people are exposed to even the topic, and maybe not the best information. Maybe there's some myths mixed in with the facts there, and there's just a whole host of reasons that we want to talk about this, but we can get into some more of them. Did you all have any other central reasons?
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, sports for me and a lot of people I know is a huge part of just what we pay attention to, what we talk to, what we. So it goes to that role models part is we talk about all these guys, right? We talk about all these people, and up until 2014 with the Ray Rice video, all this stuff was kind of swept under the rug, right? Not only domestic violence, but any sort of violence issues or whatever it may be, kind of swept under the rug, not talked about. We didn't hear about it until that video. So just being kind of a huge part of society, I think it's not without obviously these issues. So that's why it's important to talk about it.
Absolutely. The three of us were kind of joking a little earlier about how I am not a sports fan. I really don't know anything about, sports and fandom and all of that. But Mitch was one of the first folks as a colleague who brought this topic to my attention of where you have this strong fandom around your home team, your family's team, all of that sort of thing, that when somebody is called to account for their use of violence in their home, in their relationships, or even against other team members or other folks in the sports organization, that really stands out to him once he started working in anti-violence work. And so it's just been an area that's been really interesting to me ever since he kind of shed light on it for me.
Awesome. And I'm a pretty big sports fan, some sports more than others. And Mitch, what is your fandom status?
Man, that's what I do when I leave work or when I have time. That's what I'm doing, right? Even when I don't have time, it's on in the background. And I'm a giant Cub fan. Since I've been tiny, I've been a giant Cub fan, Bulls fan, Bears fan. I go to Sox games. Not a Sox fan, but all of them. I'm a huge fan of all the Chicago sports. Not as big of hockey, but once I get in the playoffs, I follow. But I live and die by, especially these two right here, the Bulls and the Cubs, and then put the Bears on there. That to describe basically every day of my life. I'm following one of those kind of one of those teams. I was just talking because yesterday was the 5th anniversary, right? So the Cubs 5 years ago won the World Series yesterday. And so I was talking to my brother, and like most of our like times when we're like, that's the best day of our, like at grandma's when she was 100, right? To watch the World Series down in Wrigleyville to do it. Like, so this part of like just the culture of my family. So it's pretty ingrained.
And I think that is actually a really like relevant point of context for the conversation. Us, and I think it's also a good balance to have Kerry, who's not so much of a sports fan, but more of, very much a DV advocate. So there is that. And by the way, Mitch, I had to say you have the best background that kind of meets the criteria for the episode. So that was awesome when I saw that.
Yeah, I figured we're doing this one. My wife Tiffany's in the basement working, so I couldn't be where I normally am. So I'm like, let me go where some sports are in the back. This is where I come to watch sports anyways. So
absolutely.
Perfect. So let's kind of stay on this, and I wanted to talk to you, Mitch, first, and ask you, can you tell us about a time when a player that you rooted for, that you knew, got convicted of DV, and kind of like what were your reactions to that?
yeah, I mean, talking about the 2016 Cubs, I actually wrote about, I don't know where it is or where it lives, but when I was at then South Suburban Family Shelter, and it was the Cubs signed Aroldis Chapman in the middle, like towards the end of the Cubs season. They had been dominating all year, right? Great season, high expectations. In the beginning of that season, Chapman actually received the first suspension for domestic violence under the new policy. So it was a 30-game suspension. He was then on the Yankees, and he received a 30 game. He served the suspension, came back, and then the Cubs traded for him. And it was such a collision of things, because best closer in baseball. He's going to get us over the hump. Like, we knew it then that, this guy's going to help us win the World Series, which is especially the Cubs, it's 100-something years since they won, all these things. But it's a dude that, just got, I don't know if he got convicted, but suspended through the MLB investigation nonetheless. And the story came out about, like, and I don't know all the details, but part of it was like his girlfriend or partner who was like in the garage hiding from him shooting gunshots. So very serious incidents. And it was such a collision. Like, my fandom won't tell me to stop rooting. I can't do that. But you have to address it, and it had to be talked about. So that's like the biggest one. And my whole thing was, well, what happened during that suspension? Did he just get suspended and that's it? Right? They don't really tell you what happens while he's out. Does he go to, mandated courses? Does he do nothing? So that kind of confusion, that kind of added to that conflicting feelings there. So that's like the biggest one I could think of. And while we're talking about the Cubs, the same team, their shortstop, Addison Russell, who at the time was my favorite player on the team, just by how he played. You didn't hear about anything off the field. So you're like, oh, that's usually a good thing when you don't hear off the field. And then a couple years after the World Series, I believe it was like 2019 is when DV stuff started coming out. So yeah, specifically with the my favorite team of all time, there's so much, of those colliding feelings that come up with it. So it's pretty prevalent with that team specifically.
Definitely. And I can appreciate how, sports are kind of, they're a getaway from normal life, right? And a lot of people would like to keep them separate. But I think when it's like something like that serious, when it's domestic violence and they are getting suspended for it, and we have confirmed that that's the case, that's kind of where at least I can draw the line. That's like a clear time where it's like, well, we're not in a bubble here. So, and I see we have a cat appearance, which is awesome.
That's fantastic.
Perhaps Ray is a sports fan that I wasn't aware of, but he's decided to join us. Yeah, I think anytime you have a strong fandom, whether it's in sports or in music or acting or shows or books, series, when those things become beloved to us, they become a part of our identity. It's like Mitch was saying. I mean, I so well understand Mitch and his family's Cubs fandom, despite the fact that I don't know anything about sports or baseball, that I will never forget the fact that his grandma was 100 watching the Cubs win, and like you said, in over 100 years or whatever the timing is. And that I remember how much he talked about that. And that was just like such a huge family memory for them. And the other thing I wanted to touch on is, I thought it was a really good observation you shared, Mitch, about what's happening while he's suspended. What's happening while somebody who has chosen to use violence against their partner or their children or their family in some way, and they get suspended from their work. your average person is probably getting court mandated classes, is probably getting some sort of consequence related to that, and an attempt to engage them in choosing to change their violent behavior. But when it's a public figure, like Mitch is talking about, we don't necessarily get to hear all of that. And, Anew as an agency firmly believes people can change their behavior. We have a partner abuse intervention program, and I think it would be really, it's an opportunity for huge sports organizations like MLB, or even individual teams like the Cubs, to say, we're taking this seriously. And in fact, we're asking this player to engage in an intervention program, and et cetera, because that sets an example on a huge stage where all of these folks, because the Condons are not the only family that approaches the Cubs this way. There's all of these folks that would have an opportunity to see that intervention and not wonder what's going to happen. They'd know what was happening. They'd see that person being held accountable.
Yeah, and I think so much of what happens is, or at least it feels like they're just, hey, we said it. Hey, we suspended him. Oh yeah, he's taking, counseling. It just seems like they go through the list that they Google. What should we do if this happens?
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel real, and they don't say the right things. They just kind of are giving that lip service to be like, hey, no, we're doing the right thing, but they don't really go into detail. So it makes you wonder, like, well, where is the change coming from? You're not changing from sitting home,
Yeah.
Yeah, and kind of strangely, it's like the victim gets outed, right? Because you know who the person's dating, so you find out that they're the victim, but at the same time, you don't know what the accountability is exactly on the other side. As you were saying, like, to reiterate Kerry's point, 30 weeks of domestic violence classes in our program, that's intensive. That's a full program. It's been established, and people have been going through it for a very long time, versus what you're saying, Mitch. Oh, maybe they get team counseling with their team counselor. And it's like, how much empathetic confrontation is there? How much, how much are we, challenging them and seeing their language and what their underlying beliefs are? And that's unknown.
Yeah. It kind of seems like they're just checking boxes. And I remember when, like, and it all started with that Ray Rice, because a video came out. So the general public was like, oh, this actually happens. Like, yeah, we know. But when that all happened, then it started, like, the leagues and teams were starting to hire DV professionals. But after that initial thing, I didn't hear what they did or anything about it. So you kind of just hear that, oh, they're hired, but then a suspension happens because of domestic violence, or, an incident occurs before the suspension, and you don't hear from that person. So I'm like, what are they doing? I just, and maybe they're doing the right thing. Maybe there's behind the scenes stuff, but usually that stuff kind of gets out, and it seems like it would do a service to the teams to, be upfront about it.
Yeah, to have that transparency so that everybody knows the team is taking it seriously and it's not lip service, but that they're actually doing work to assess what's happened in the past and change the culture and the expectations going forward. Where if you just hire somebody in the moment, but then nobody really hears any updates about it anymore, you're left exactly like Mitch is describing, that you assume, oh, they just needed somebody in the moment until the storm passed, but they're not really making sustainable change.
Right.
Yeah, and I did look up a little bit on the main four leagues. So you've got MLB, baseball, NBA, which is basketball, NFL, which is football, and then the NHL, which is hockey. And around, or 2015 was MLB's policy. They finally put one out, and they did have mandated domestic violence classes, and policy is pretty good. But then, for example, like with the Ray Rice case, there was a 2-game suspension there, it's not very long. I mean, that's 2 games out of 16. And now they've raised it since 2016. They updated it. Now it's 6 games for the first time. And then second time, you're kicked out of the league, which was actually pretty substantial improvement. NBA also in 2016 updated their policies. So you can see right around that 2015, 2016 era, there was a big change. But we can talk about what's happened in the 5 years since then, of course. But then, interestingly, the NHL has no domestic violence policy. They do a case by case basis where ultimately it's up to the commissioner and the person right below him, the deputy commissioner.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't think that's too much different though than the NFL. Even though the NFL has the policy, it's so inconsistently, passed out that it might as well not be a policy. So like Ray Rice gets 2 games for knocking out his fiance in an elevator, and then somebody inflates a football too much, they get like 8 games. That's that message is it's throwing the policy out. It doesn't matter at that point. So the inconsistencies, and that's just one example. There's infinity with the NFL, but to not even try the NHL doesn't make any sense to me either. Like, at least let's start the effort.
Yeah, I would think that if you're a big sports organization like that, a huge corporation, that you see MLB get into that, to what Zach identified from 2015, where they had players, everything was in the news, and then they started being very public about, this is our policy and we're hiring a consultant and et cetera. Typically what you would see in other corporations is they'd be looking at that and thinking, we want to avoid liability, and so we're going to start doing that before we get in trouble. So the fact that the NHL didn't see all those other sports orgs doing that work and say to themselves, we better do that, is kind of a red flag. Why aren't you being proactive in dealing with an issue that you see other sports organizations dealing with around people's safety?
And if I remember, like, somebody in the NHL, I don't remember if it was commissioner, somebody in the league of some sort mentioned something like, oh, well, that doesn't happen in our league, which is like that's like the first like myth that we go over, right, in presentations. And there were also very public ones that existed at the time. So it's just turning, a blind eye to it when it's super obvious.
Yeah.
It's the that doesn't happen in this community myth right there.
Right.
It's a widespread phenomenon, unfortunately, and it affects everyone. It's going, given enough people, you're going to see it. That is an interesting comparison, Mitch. For those who don't know, there was a player who was deflating footballs to kind of throw them better and faster, and there was an 8-game suspension for that.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact amount. Was it 8 games?
It was more than 2, though.
Yeah, it was more than several of the like violent things that had happened. And listen, most of the time, unfortunately, what happens with these either domestic violence or DUIs or just bar fights, like, if you're a good player, you don't get suspended a lot, right? It's unfortunate, obviously, and it shouldn't be that way, but that's how it usually goes. And the inconsistencies with the guy who was deflating the football is the best it's ever played. So, you did that little thing, but if you did this, you'd be fine, right? We wouldn't care if you abused somebody, but you better not do that. It's just wildly, because that is tarnishing the legacy of the game, as opposed to you being an abusive person, right? Yeah. So it's the inconsistency is blatant.
It does show where the values lie, right? The value seems to lie in who's going to pull people into games, who's going to make money for the team, for the club, for the organization, and who's going to put the organization in a good light. Like you were saying, is this a great player? But is this a great player who cheated? And that's going to make us look terrible. And that's going to undermine the legacy of, not only him as a player, but the team he was on and all of that sort of thing. And it's really confusing as to why somebody that does significant, potentially lethal harm to people that they're intimate with, whether that's their partner, other family members, kids, even violence in the community, that the powers that be in that field aren't responding to that in the same way. It's not viewed as equally damaging to the reputation of everybody concerned as is cheating, for example.
Yeah. Well, I think, Kerry, you said this, I think maybe before we started recording, but it goes with these giant corporations and their money, right? So if you're a good player and you're going to bring my franchise, more people in the seats, more success, getting to the playoffs or whatever it may be, oh, we could look past this, right? We'll get past it. We'll take on the
Yeah.
negative press or whatever. That happened with the Bears when I was at Southburn Family Shelter too. The guy Ray McDonald, who the Bears signed after he had, I think, already had a DV charge. There was an open rape investigation, I think, going on, and it all boiled down to the coach at the time, the defensive coordinator at the time, saying, "Oh, he's a good guy. Oh, okay, let's sign him." And he signed, and then several months later, like another situation happened, and they had to cut him because finally the pressure came on. But again, it's one of those things like, yeah, you can see the signs. It doesn't take a professional to see an open investigation,
Right.
But he was good, right? So let's look the other way because we want to win.
Yeah, we want to win, and we want to increase and guarantee revenue. And I know we're sounding very cynical right now, but one of the ways that systemic change can happen in a capitalist society like ours is that big corporations make change. And because money gets put on the line, that change tends to stick and become widespread. And so, NHL and all of these organizations are uniquely positioned to make cultural changes in their organizations and in the sports that they cover that could have a real lasting and widespread impact on our society. Because go back to how Mitch started with this episode of like, this is what he does in any moment he's got free time. Your new dad, you're now introducing your son to all the sports. You probably gave him notice that he's a Cubs fan, I assume. Yeah, right away he found out he's a Cubs fan. And there's all of these folks that have that fandom, and if these clubs, if these organizations are giving the message, we don't stand for interpersonal violence, we don't stand for community violence, that trickles down to all those folks that follow them and hold them up and view them as role models. And that's a way that that's one of the many ways that real widespread change can happen.
And I think, unfortunately, it kind of seamlessly transitions into the most recent news with the Chicago Blackhawks, and it just came out, within a week or so, and there was a sexual assault that happened. And again, it really gets to both of what you're saying. It happened in one of their very big playoff runs, and essentially they thought it was too big of a distraction to handle, based on what the team was doing and where the team was at in the playoffs, rather than having a zero tolerance policy. And I know, of course, we're talking about domestic violence here, but the way that those sexual assault and domestic violence are handled usually typically go hand in hand.
Yeah, I mean, the dynamics are similar, especially how they're handled. The Blackhawks one, it's outrageous. I think you were mentioning that this, you hear about it and you're like, oh, this is 11 years old. This is from 2015. How did we not hear about it? And then you find out all these people heard about it, but it was their first 2010 even. I don't something like that. 2010. So it was their first run in forever. So the players, the coaches, kind of like okay, sure, and then some of them, I'm sure, and I've heard a couple of stories where they told their superior, and like, okay, I'm sure it's taken care of, and then never followed up, never thought another thing about it, and it just kept hitting that dead end because I'm sure everyone above thought, no, we don't want to, cause a distraction. That's a big sports thing. Oh no, there's a distraction in the locker room. Yeah, what about this person's life?
Yeah, absolutely right. And lots of things stood out. You've highlighted a lot of the different things that stood out to me with this story. And some of that is the reporting on this story has really highlighted all the same dynamics we see in domestic violence. So this was sexual assault, but we're also seeing the power and control dynamics that are so profound in domestic violence, intimate partner violence. And we're also seeing systemic issues. What's the culture of the team? What's the culture of the sport? What's the culture of this, as you go out in concentric circles, you've got the sport itself, you've got this particular team, you've got the NHL. And if the culture is, we don't have that problem here, when statistically, we know you do have this problem, just like everybody else, then that blindness allows those systemic issues to remain static, which means sexual assaults are going to continue to happen. Domestic violence is going to continue to happen. And there's going to be no effective support for victims. And there's going to be no effective intervention for people doing harm. And, you know, in listening to the survivor in that case talk about his experience, he's highlighting all of the impacts of trauma. He's talking about dealing with substance abuse. He's talking about dealing with deep-seated shame. He's talking about suppressing his emotions and his experiences in order to cope. These are things that domestic violence victims talk about regularly, you know, as a response to the trauma of being harmed.
And coming out and putting your name on it, right? Like that's always a case with these situations. And obviously in a sports league, it's in front of every camera. You know, so a lot of times they just want this fame. I don't know, but people say that, right? They want the attention, which is wild to me. It doesn't make any sense. Who wants that attention? But that 10 years, 11 years until he was able to come out and actually put his name on it because of all of those different things. He wanted to continue that dream that he had his whole life. And then even to the people that didn't say anything, I'm not saying it's easy to say anything, right? Because sports is, if the volume of you, right, your everyone talking about you in the media outweighs what you do on the field or the rink, then you're going to get cut. So there's that kind of power dynamic there that you have to deal with.
Absolutely.
So there's so many layers to these situations in a locker room and in these leagues.
Yeah, that power dynamic was really key here. Just kind of reading the report, the person who assaulted him was basically saying, because the player who had been assaulted was a rookie, he's a first-year player, had just gotten called up, was basically saying, like, if you say anything, you're not going to have a career. And I mean, anyone who's played a sport with any sort of ambition to make it in the professional leagues knows that's like it's essentially your whole life leading up to that moment. You've been working towards that, training and going through all the leagues and all the games and everything. And also, all the money that you're going to leave on the table. I know it's tough, but this person they still did come out and actually say something despite all that, which is super tough. And there may be cases that we just simply don't know about, where no one said anything.
Yeah, and that's why this is important, because then, if you are somebody who hasn't, this guy's on, one of the biggest sports shows in, I think it was on Canada, but either way, it's good. It's gone everywhere, this interview. So if at least hopefully that's a message that, okay, I'm not alone. I can come forward. I can, rely on some people, because he did a good job at calling out the people who did support him, including the guy who interviewed him. And so to me, it would kind of open up the door for people to reach out to him or, others in their organization. So I think that was important for that.
Yeah, I agree. And I feel like as a man and a professional athlete to come out, he's facing deeply ingrained stigma against this doesn't happen to men. And all of those kind of degrading things that society puts out there. A real man wouldn't have let this happen. And all of those are myths, right? Victimization doesn't care who you are, what your identity is. When somebody chooses to do violence to you, it's not about who you are, it's about who they are and what they're choosing to do. And so his choice to come out, I think, is in that context, that he knew he wouldn't be believed. He knew that he'd get made fun of. And certainly all the reports talk about that there were homophobic slurs getting thrown around because there's this ingrained sort of toxic masculinity that I know we've talked about on T before that says, if you quote unquote, let somebody hurt you, then that's on you. And so for him to say something in the moment 11 years ago and now come out publicly and share his real identity and tell us this is the experience in the 11 years since, I think is such a generous act for the conversation around violence, because the way he was responded to is how victims are often responded to. He was blamed for his assault. You put yourself in this situation. He was threatened to stay quiet. All of these things tend to happen where we have intimate partner violence. And so his choice to come and be open about it and talk about it and re-engage in traumatic experiences he's had, I think really is an opportunity for folks who don't normally get involved in these kind of conversations to learn.
And talk about, shutting down a myth. I mean, he's the stereotypical tough guy, right? He's a hockey player.
Right.
Toughest guys that you
like he's a huge, strong guy. Yeah.
Right.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's like just taking down the myth of this can't happen to you. You
right.
Something must be wrong with you. No, it takes down that myth pretty quickly.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a professional athlete, I mean, you can't really get much more physically stronger than that, where that myth really stems from. So, yeah, I mean, we've touched on it a bit here, but I do just I just wonder like what message we're sending to especially younger people coming up, because that's really where that role model comes in, and especially when the accountability is not there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately in sports, there's so much of that negative messaging early on in kids' life. Not even about like violence. It's just about whatever. It doesn't matter what you do, because if you're good, we got you. We'll get you through. Which is good if they need help getting through something. But it doesn't matter what you do off the court. It doesn't matter what you do off the ice. We're gonna block that away because you're good, and that happens from early on now, because kids are so specialized in sports, right? Like a lot of times, most people used to do all the different sports. Now kids a lot of times do one sport throughout the whole year. So if you're good in that and you're in this club and you mess up outside of that, we're going to kind of push it under the rug. So it starts, unfortunately, from such a young age. Now, not everybody. I coach against so many teams that positive and don't do that, but it starts so young with that. Your ability is more important than your humanity, which is obviously a problem.
Yeah, I was super curious. We've been talking about like big sports, in the sense of corporations and that sort of thing. But I was really interested, Mitch, to hear your perspective, because you were involved in youth sports your whole life as a player and then as a coach, and just to hear a little bit of insight from you about those experiences. Like, did you have coaches that had this sort of like damaging messaging and tolerated violent behavior or other kinds of things? Did you have coaches that were really effective in setting role models for you and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I was lucky. I had great coaches kind of throughout. Like swimming, which I did most of the time, and water polo, I had two guys that were great. So never, but I've been in locker rooms or things where negative things have happened, right? Where different slurs are thrown out just like casually. So if you were somebody in those settings, that was going through something or that nobody knew about, right? You would feel a certain way. Now my coaches did a good job of kind of shutting that down when necessary, when it got, outrageous or anything like that. But yeah, I was lucky enough to have pretty good coaches where they kind of shut that down, or, just were positive examples themselves.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I've also coached against some people that you're like, what happens at, practice when nobody else is around? There's 5 teams here that are watching the way you're talking to your athletes. So you don't know what goes back, at their practices when no one else is watching. But for the most part, my experiences personally have been pretty positive.
You made a really great observation about if you're somebody who's been victimized and you're hearing how your peers and your teammates and maybe even your coaches are talking about other folks that have been victimized, that's going to have a real impact on whether you feel safe to say, hey, I need help. I've had something happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, like I was part of a locker room that we talked that way. Not proud of it or anything, but now I think luckily that locker room I'm talking about, we are all friends still. So I think we're all comfortable if we talk about whatever. So I think we maybe dodged a bullet from being, acting a certain way. Not that all teams do that, but it happens in locker rooms. But again, not proud of it. But yeah, even if someone identified a certain way and we didn't know, there's no way they'd be telling the people
Yeah,
in that
makes
locker
sense.
room or anything like that. So it has an opportunity when those sort of things come up to get, to be a huge problem. You hope that somebody, a coach, a person in that locker room steps up and kind of squashes it. Doesn't always happen though.
And your comment about youth sports, Mitch, it actually, because I played youth sports my whole life as well, and it kind of brought up some memories. And it wasn't necessarily like a toleration of violence per se, but it was more like if they had a standard for grades, if they had a standard for if you get like an in-school suspension, like you're not supposed to play that game, and you can tell already then at that at that age in the teenage years, it's like, well, you know, maybe he's got an F, but we've got the big game, and then all the kids who are sitting on the bench going, well, I took care I took care of my stuff. I did everything I was asked to do, and here I am sitting on the bench, and it kind of can build resentment, and it really does send the wrong message. Although it's not violence at first, but it does kind of send the message to kids that you can kind of get away with stuff. And
Yeah,
then that ultimately could lead to worse cases like violence.
absolutely. It reminds me, you asked about my coaches and then you brought up grades. I got benched for weeks and my dad was the coach. So because of my grades in grammar school. So yeah. But when you're talking about that, it's kind of reminding me just of how winning, and this goes to everything we've been talking about. Winning is held up, right? I mean, I watched the World Series end last night. I love watching, especially the final games of something win, right? It's exciting. I love winning. I hate to lose, all that stuff. But if you're a coach of anything, or a leader of young people in anything, teacher, coach, whatever it may be, you have to, at least to an extent of some, say, okay, no, winning is not as important as this, right? Winning is not as important as this message. And we all have these different biases too. Exactly. Because listen, there's some kids on my swim team or in my class that, I'm like, all right, I'll let you chatter a little bit more because you're going to get it done. Right. But then you have to be able to recognize, okay, that can't keep going. I can't let that extend. I am doing that. So it happens, but you have to recognize it before it gets to a point where now that kid's, getting in a fight at school and then expecting to show up and play.
Yeah. Yeah, that strong leadership of being like, all right, let's get it together and hold ourselves accountable. Me, the coach, you, the players, all of us are accountable to the higher ideal of winning at any cost is not what we want to do. Winning by playing solid, winning by being, responsible and accountable is really what I hear you saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And again, it's not easy, right? I mess up in it all the time, I'm sure, but conversations like this help to remind you, right? And I promise in my fourth grade classroom, that's our accountable is the first thing on our agreements, because I'm like, that's where we're starting. I don't care if you guys don't know what it is yet. You're going to know the word, right? Because that's where that's where everything else comes from. So it's like, these sort of conversations are supposed to be had. You're supposed to get some pushback from other coaches too, so you can, make progress.
Yeah.
So is there any hope for the future? Is there a more, because I know we've been somewhat one-sided, but I think for real reasons and for we are kind of reacting to what's happened at this point. But do either of you see changes in the positive direction from all of this?
Mitch, you're much more well suited to this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think I do as an overview, kind of if you step back and look at it as a whole, because we're going to continue to call out these things no matter how much progress we make. So it's important but like the NBA, I think is pretty a very progressive league, and it's a league where like the commissioner works with the players, so there's more communication, which leads to more of that change. And then public pressure, it does work. Now I'm not saying some of these people that like go and call for every single person's job and for like small things, but like public pressure, the more people that are talking about this, the more media that's covering it, the more radio stations covering it, that adds pressure, and it goes back to their pockets, which is important. Like Kerry, you mentioned, if their pocket's affected, now all of a sudden they care, which is a problem. But there's also owners in all these sports that every once in a while you hear an owner speak up against DV or violence in general. So I think there is. I mean, just today, I think an NFL player got cut for, now it's not DV or anything, but DUI that caused death, and he right away was cut. And pretty decent player. So like those sort of things, there's not like that conversation about. No, let's move past it.
This is the consequence. Yeah.
All right, this is the consequence. So I think there is. It seems incremental when you're zoomed in on it, I think, but I think there is real change happening throughout these leagues. And again, it all goes back to the one video. We had to see video of it, unfortunately, in the Ray Rice situation. And it's kind of, I mean, if we talk about from then till now, it's been a huge difference. I think just in the way we talk about it even.
Yeah. I agree with you, Mitch. And as we have joked about, I don't have the insight into how sports works and professional sports works to say from that level. But when there's a couple things, like as DV advocates, as anti-violence advocates, we want a paradigm shift. We want people in power to say to themselves, hey, power and control, systems of power, systems of oppression all go into how people are harmed and traumatized by others. And if we can't get that paradigm shift, we still want harm reduction. We still want change. And so if it means that we hit them in their pocketbook and they're concerned about their money and they make change from that perspective, we can start there, and continue to have the conversation about how do we change society's view on this overall? How do we change professional sports view on this overall? And then the other thing that I thought that you said, Mitch, that stands out to me is you said we're seeing some of these changes and they may seem incidental. Incidental changes can make profound change down the line. Change doesn't happen linearly. It happens from all sorts of different sources and in all sorts of different ways. And I mean, it's changes like you said today about the player who got cut today related to his DUI and the consequent death of at least somebody. I'm not familiar with the case, but it also is the coaching changes for youth sports that you talked about. You're a coach who is holding himself accountable and checking himself when you are like, I didn't love my coaching decision there, or how I interacted with this kid over fill in the blank. Those kind of changes are all part of a broader movement. And so from my perspective, the more we have folks who engage with these topics and these dynamics and then make purposeful, intentional changes in how they move through the world, that's a huge part of shifting things. I mean, look at Mitch talking about how accountability is the first thing on the agreements for his fourth grade class. For me, having worked with Mitch, I know where the roots of that are. He worked in anti-violence work and violence prevention with youth, and now he's a teacher, and he's like, let me take all of that learning with me and use it with my students to say, we're going to hold ourselves accountable for when we break agreements, for when we do harm, for whatever.
Yeah, and I'll just have to third that. I think it is looking better if you look at like the late 90s. I mean, I was seeing like MLB players who would get arrested and then it was like, well, if you could still show up to work the next day, like we're not going to do anything about it. And that there were several cases of that versus, the Ray Rice 2-game suspension. Like that's like the most slap on the wrist that ever was. And then now implementing policies and actually having the framework in place. And I think like Mitch said, when you're zoomed in, may not seem like it, but I do kind of have to agree and take that zoomed out view and kind of look where we are.
Yeah. I think fandoms like these have power. And if the fandom says, we don't like this behavior from our teams, from our players, from our clubs, from everybody, from their sports organizations, then ultimately that's going to hold power because you will speak with your money. You'll speak with your tickets.
Yeah. I mean, it happens when teams are bad for so long that we speak with our money. We're not giving it to you.
Right.
So if you got a team that's constantly, not doing anything about these sort of situations, it's unfortunately, it always goes back to their pockets, especially these owners who are, billionaires, and that's what speaks to them.
Yeah.
So really awesome conversation. either of you have any closing remarks?
No, thanks for including me as my closing remark. Yeah.
Yeah, super happy to be back. I love having these conversations because, like I said, for reasons that are selfishly to me, I'm like these conversations help get them back to the front of my brain and help me it rejuvenates that passion. So always happy to be back. And then you combine sports in it, and I'm probably more chatty on this one than I have been on other ones. So thanks for having me back.
For good reason. Well, thanks again for being here, Mitch. Really appreciate that. You coming back and to your old place of work. Love to see that. And thanks, Kerry, for jumping in on this conversation, even though not the sports person, but still lots of things that I don't always think about, which is why it was awesome to have you.
Right on. Thanks very much.
All right. And thanks everyone for listening. We'll be back next week. Same place, same time with different tea.